This story begins with a family at the zoo who were taking a walk and ended up at the wolf enclosures, where their father pointed out to the child to look at them. These wolves, on the other hand, were perfectly domesticated and calm in their cage, yawning and sleeping, until suddenly they all turned around and jumped in fright, surprised to see someone among the audience. An apparently normal girl was on a date with another guy, and from the looks of it, they were having a good time. But as the girl walked through the zoo, all the animals that observed her stopped what they were doing and became alert to her presence, which scared the boy quite a bit. Meanwhile, the girl calmly walked up to the cages and then started running towards the monkey enclosure. When the monkeys saw that she had approached them, they started fleeing to the central part of the enclosure to escape from her, some crying, tears, and screams, confusing everyone present, both the couple and the onlookers who found the monkeys' actions strange. This made the boy on the date even more worried. At one point, they ended up at the tiger enclosure, a large and imposing animal. When the girl passed near its cage, the tiger stood up and became alert, growling at her from the cage. However, the girl, in turn, only trembled and kept walking, which confused the tiger. But suddenly, the girl slowly began to turn around until she stared directly into the tiger's eyes, with eyes that had changed and were not human, and a face that was developing black spots that covered her entire face. Both of them stared at each other for a few seconds, and the girl licked her face for a moment, until the boy suddenly asked Charlotte what she was doing and told her to keep walking. The girl, on her part, just turned back with her normal face, while the tiger where it stood had urinated in fear and was trembling. As they walked through the zoo, the boy would ask Charlotte what she wanted for dinner, to which she responded that she wanted to eat tiger. In another place, we see what appeared to be a maximum security prison, with a heavily reinforced door, and screams could be heard from whoever was inside. Then, a man with an apparently injured face would start screaming to be let out, addressing anyone who might be outside, observing from his cell door the hallway in which he was locked. Inside, the man was panting, crying, and shouting to be released. But suddenly, from the shadows, two bright spots could be seen, possibly eyes, observing them from a distance. The man would notice and turn around in fear, seeing how these two lights started approaching him, forming a silhouette that gradually began to take shape. This same silhouette would place one of its paws on one of the dolls, which would start making noise. The man would tell it to stay away, frightened, cornering himself against the wall, while this silhouette grew larger and larger, staring at him, and more eyes began to emerge from its body until it finally revealed a mouth. The man, on his part, would only insult the people who locked him up, cursing and insulting them. From the outside, several blows could be seen slowly destroying the door until finally, all the noise stopped, creating a profound silence for a few seconds, until a blood stain would appear through the small gap in the door. Then, what appeared to be a sharp black stain emerged from the space in the door, and it slowly started to retract after accomplishing its goal, while blood began to trickle from underneath. Inside, in the darkness of the room, the sound of the creature that was inside would be heard, finishing devouring whatever was left of the man in there. In another place, we see three boys on the rooftop of a building. One of them was the boy from the date, wearing a hoodie, seemingly worried about something, while one of his friends who was there handed him the cell phone, telling him to make a call, to call someone, and that everything would be all right. Then the boy would start telling us his story, saying that 2 years ago, he had left his home, and now he was using the cell phone to make a call to his father, who, upon hearing him, would remain silent for a few minutes, leaving both his son and the friends present in suspense. Finally, the father spoke up and said that it had been a while. That same night, the boy laughed and seemed cheerful, saying that he was looking forward to the outcome of the conversation and telling his friends not to worry and drink. Meanwhile, his friends looked at him seemingly worried, while he kept drinking and enjoying the moment. Eventually, after a few hours, the boy, seemingly intoxicated, started getting angry and insulting his parents. As he remembered the conversation, the boy asked his father how he had been, and his father responded that he had been fine, or so he thought. Then they both fell into a tense silence again. The boy tried to ask about his mother and if she was okay, to which his father replied that she was fine, bringing some relief to the boy, but only to return to silence once more. The boy thought it was very uncomfortable, thinking that it had only been a while, and that he could still go back, encouraging himself to say it. When he was about to say something, his father told him to take care and, without listening to what he had said, hung up the call. Back in the present, the boy started crying as his friends approached to console him. After a while, the boy finally fell asleep, while his friends were still awake drinking. The friend who was present said that she had thought about calling her parents but was glad she didn't after seeing how it turned out for her friend. The next morning, the boy slowly woke up, realizing that it was almost noon, and complained to his friends, saying that they should have at least woken him up. A few minutes later, we would be at the place where the boy worked. He apologized, saying that he would never be late again, but the owner of the place told him to leave, which confused the boy, pleading for another chance. The owner asked if he was deaf as he stood up and approached the boy, pushing him and telling him to get out, expressing no interest in latecomer kids. The protagonist would try to come up with an excuse, but the owner of the place started smelling him and questioned the boy if he had been drinking, which scared him. The owner then expressed disbelief, as he believed he had been told that the boy needed to study, and asked if he wasn't underage. The boy remained silent, looking aside, but instead of waiting for an answer, the man told him it didn't matter and to get out, pushing him out of the establishment. Sure, here's the corrected and organized text in paragraphs. Outside, the boy would say that it didn't matter since he wasn't even paid the minimum wage, which would surprise the man, leaving him dumbfounded. In a fit of anger, the boy started yelling that he quit and slammed the door shut from the outside, walking away angrily and stomping his feet. The man, on his part, just told him he'd better run, complaining about these kids and kids in general, while there was another person inside the place. The man, in turn, turned to see a well-dressed man eating in the establishment. After walking for a while, the boy ended up on what seemed to be a main street. There, standing in the middle of the street, he let out a frustrated scream, complaining about how the hell he would find another job now, as he could barely get that one, calling himself an idiot, and attempting to strangle himself with his own hands. But then he heard a voice coming from behind him. As he turned to see who it was, apparently, it was the same man who was eating at the restaurant a few minutes ago, at the place he had just left. This man in a suit asked him if he was a student, to which the boy replied no and asked why he was asking that. The man asked if he was looking for a job, but the boy hesitantly replied no, so the man smiled and handed him a card, saying that he didn't trust him but would give him a card with information about a good place that paid well and provided accommodation, telling him to call if he was interested. The boy hesitated for a few seconds but eventually took the card and asked what kind of place it was. The man would tell him that it was a physical job and that he looked like a strong guy. He said he would give him more details when he called, so he could take his time, and that it wasn't anything illegal in case he was wondering. The boy would ask about the pay, to which the man, while waving goodbye and turning to leave, would tell him it was as high as nowhere else he had worked, and that they would talk more when he was sure. As the man left, the boy would carefully examine the card. That same night, in the same building where the boy lived with his two friends, they would be having a conversation because the boy wanted to have relations, but she didn't, saying she was tired. The boy would say how she could be tired being so young. And while in bed, the boy would ask what they would do about Charlie since they had just convinced him to leave. But he never expected his father to be someone like that. The girl, on her part, would complain and ask how much longer he planned to stay, and that if he worked far away, it would have been the perfect time for them. The boy would agree, say she was right, and wish they could just live together, but Charlie made things more difficult. But the girl would say that, if it weren't for him, the boy would have never met her since Charlie was the one who brought her in the first place. The boy would say he knew that and turned to ask them if they wanted to live like that forever, to which the girl would say no. The boy was considering whether to tell her directly to leave, but it was difficult to be direct when he had nowhere to go. While the girl would find this comment endearing, telling him he was as sweet as a baby. Meanwhile, Charlie was holding a food box at the apartment door and apparently, he had overheard the whole conversation. In another place, in the same room from a few moments ago, where that black stain was, it was apparently feeding on more bodies that had entered the place. Outside that long and heavily guarded hallway, two men in suits were observing everything. Two men in suits were just observing that hallway. And one of them, with a scar on his face, would say that he didn't even break a sweat, and that they had spent everything to trap him, yet they couldn't even confront him, and at this rate, his appetite could be too much even for them. Both men were chewing gum, and one of them would then ask if he didn't have anyone else, so the man in the black suit would say something, but his phone started ringing, saying they finally had someone. And this man would turn out to be the same one who had offered Charlie a job a few moments ago. Meanwhile, inside the cage, you could see how this dark stain was reminding the people it had killed, and as it continued to remember, it would show that it had also killed other animals that had tried to attack it, only to end up being all killed by this same dark stain. Upon remembering all of this, it would end up vomiting, only to shrink and take the form of what seemed to be a small baby. On the other hand, during the night on the city streets, a man in a trench coat with a hood covering his face would be walking alone with a briefcase, but he would suddenly turn around, only to see that there was nothing behind him. He would continue walking and eventually arrive at the same food establishment where Charlie worked. Inside, the owner would be reading the newspaper, apologizing and saying that they had already closed. The man in the trench coat would finally remove his hood, and the owner would recognize him, calling him Dr. Hyen. Dr. Hyen, with a serious face, would observe the owner and ask if the others were downstairs. He would then start entering the deeper part of the establishment, eventually reaching what appeared to be the stairs leading to a basement. But upon reaching the bottom, it seemed to be a much larger building. Reaching the end of one of the hallways connected to those stairs, he would start knocking on the door. And inside, he would be greeted by the two men in suits. The man with the scar would welcome him with a smile, saying he was his favorite doctor and that the days he came for a visit had become his favorites. He would tell him to come in and take a seat, while the man in the black suit would silently observe while blowing a bubble with his gum. Once everyone was seated, Dr. Hyen would offer the briefcase to the men in suits, saying it was the payment for that month. The man with the scar would remark that he brought it in cash again and that was why he liked this doctor. The man would then ask how the baby was doing, to which Dr. Hyen would also inquire. The man in the suit would say that he still didn't understand why he kept calling it a baby, and he would say that it was doing well, killing well, and eating well. He would mention that he had told him this several times before, but training it to fight made no sense since the food was no match for that thing. Meanwhile, Dr. Hyen, ignoring this, would simply put his hand in his pocket and say that even adult men did nothing more than feed it. Then, the man with the scar would give a glance to Dr. Hyen and tell him that's why he was thinking it didn't have to be human, saying that since they weren't a great challenge anyway, they could just buy the meat and feed it, mentioning that it was becoming difficult to bring men to feed it and evade the police. These comments were apparently making Dr. Hyen angry, who would say that there was no reason then to give them that money, taking the briefcase back, while the man with the scar would say he got the message and that he was just joking, saying that they were getting them without anyone noticing, just as he had requested. Dr. Hyen would put his hood back on, covering his face, and say that it didn't matter if the prey was weak. A predator needs prey, and as he stood up, he would say that the baby was still too young to kill someone strong, so they had to keep it that way for now. Then, Dr. Hyen would start leaving the place, being bid farewell by the bar owner and the restaurant owner. Dr. Hyen wouldn't return the greeting and would just keep walking. As he walked, he would start insulting the men in suits, saying that scum should know their place, and that if it weren't for the circumstances, he would never speak to trash like them. He would send a message to that dark thing in the wind, telling it to grow strong and healthy to kill them all. Observing everything, there was a man in a black hoodie and hood on the highest part of a building, watching the restaurant from which Dr. Hyen had just left. Inside the establishment, the two men in suits and the owner of the place were talking. The man with the scar would insult Dr. Hyen, saying that he hated talking to him. The man in the black suit would ask why he had accepted that job, and then the scarred man would say it was because of the amount of money, while the man in the black suit would say that the job should be about doing what one wanted, not about money. All he was doing now was feeding that monster, and besides, he couldn't even kill himself. The scarred man would say that all that matters is fighting and that at least they were making money. But it wouldn't be for much longer. Once they had enough money, they could start. The owner of the place, on the other hand, would say that they couldn't stay in that dump forever after all. But the man in the black suit would say that something smelled fishy about that job. The scarred man would throw him a handkerchief and tell him to stop chewing that gum and go find the boy. Back in Charlie's apartment, one of the boys living there would go out to observe outside, wondering why Charlie hadn't returned yet. As he looked around, he would see a food box with only chicken bones inside. He would wonder who had left it there. Meanwhile, Charlie was standing in front of the restaurant, accompanied by the man in the black suit. Charlie would recognize that place well, trying to say that it was the place where he used to work, but the man in the suit would tell him it wasn't there, but in the basement. As he walked inside, he would notice the owner of the place, who was filing his nails. Charlie would think that ever since he quit, he couldn't even see him anymore. He would mockingly think that he deserved it. As Charlie followed the man in the suit down the stairs and through the basement hallway, he would think that he had never thought that place had a basement. He would realize that maybe that was strange and wonder if it was really okay. Inside the room, he would encounter the scarred man in the suit. The man would greet him kindly, saying he looked good and healthy, and assuming that it was urgent for him to arrive so late. Charlie would simply nod and stare fixedly at the scar on his face. Then, Charlie would end up thinking that maybe he shouldn't have come and that he had a bad feeling about this place. The scarred man would ask if he had heard correctly that Charlie lived alone and if he was underage. Charlie would answer yes and if that was a problem, while the scarred man would say it wasn't an issue at all and that he should pay him a little extra, as he was sure Charlie was a very cautious person. This made Charlie stop worrying and thank the man, who would smile maliciously. Charlie, on his part, would ask what kind of place this was since they had offered him accommodation and good pay as well. Meanwhile, the man in the suit would be searching for something in a closet until he pulled out a baseball bat, saying it was perfect for a teenager. This comment would worry Charlie a bit. The man would then say that if Charlie managed to wake up alive, he would see something never seen before, and he would tell Charlie that it would try to attack him, so he should use the bat to defend himself. But he thought he would kill him even before he woke up. Well, if Charlie made it out of this alive, he would give him all the money and accommodation he desired. The boy would wonder what he was talking about, unaware that behind him, the man in the black suit would put a cloth over his nose and mouth, and Charlie would gradually start losing consciousness. While unconscious, he would hear the men in suits talking about him, saying that desperate people were very easy to deceive and that it was getting late, so they should leave him there and check on him tomorrow. One of the men would complain that this stank, and the other would tell him not to start again, to shut up, and just grab his legs. Charlie would find himself back in the center of that secured room, lying unconscious on the floor with a bat beside him. And from the shadows, the eyes of that black figure would be watching him. This black figure would start to approach slowly, until it finally becomes clear that it is a small baby. Elsewhere, we would see Dr. Hyen smoking and watching recordings of the dark creature on his computer, pondering about this thing. He would think that this thing was currently 3 weeks old, and the speed at which it kills and the amount of food it requires are constantly increasing. But the problem was that the humans used to feed it didn't pose a greater challenge. He would think that it was not good and that it wasn't getting good practice. Then, he would take out 4 syringes. He would take what appears to be a case from a drawer next to him. This case would contain 4 syringes, and Dr. Hyen would think that maybe it was a little early, but he should use it, without specifying what he is referring to. In another location, which appears to be a hospital, we would see a child with half of his head bandaged and a woman seemingly scolding someone. A stern man would be bowing his head apologetically, while next to him, Charlie would have an arrogant look, refusing to bow his head and observing everything. Once outside that place, they would both be walking, with Charlie's father keeping a great distance from his own son, with an empty look, completely ignoring him. Then, Charlie would be the first to speak after a while of silence, asking his father why he apologized since he was a punk, just like the boy in the hospital bed was a punk, just like Charlie. His father, without turning around, would remain silent and still for a few seconds, but Charlie would speak again, saying that they had a fight and he won, and why should his father apologize? His father would start getting angry slowly in silence. But then Charlie would make one last comment, saying that his old man had no pride and no balls. Finally, his father would come to a complete stop, and he would slowly turn his head to look into Charlie's eyes. Charlie would be surprised, his face frozen in silence and shock. Without saying a word, Charlie's father would continue walking, leaving his son behind. Charlie, instead of following him, would just stand there, thinking that he was sorry and wondering why only him. Back to the present, Charlie, with tears in his eyes and questioning why, would jolt awake, just remembering what had just happened, wondering where he was and if he was dead. Charlie would look at the door and realize that he was locked inside, wondering if he had been kidnapped. As he looked around, he would see several toys and dolls scattered on the floor, along with various bloodstains. Upon closer inspection, he would notice a severed arm with a knife still in its hand. When he looked up, he would see the mutilated body of a man, missing or open body parts. It was a grotesque scene that would make Charlie vomit, overwhelmed by disgust and fear. He would instinctively move away from the area until his back hit the door. In that moment, he would remember the words of the man with the scar, mentioning that if he managed to wake up alive, he would see something he had never seen before, but he would likely die before that. Sweating, panting, and trembling with fear, he would wonder what the hell this place was and who the men who had brought him there were. Then, in the darkness, he would start hearing sounds approaching him, and Charlie would grip the bat, preparing to defend himself against whatever might come out of there. Meanwhile, the figure emerging from the darkness would start recalling all the creatures it had killed before. Staring directly at Charlie, who was ready to defend himself with the bat, he would realize that what was emerging from the darkness was a small baby, which would momentarily surprise Charlie. But as he reacted, he would drop the bat and approach the baby, crouching down to pick it up in his arms while cursing the individuals who had put them in that place. The baby would look at the bat, but slowly stop seeing Charlie as a threat, witnessing him slowly approaching to hold the baby in his arms, all while Charlie continued to insult the people who had locked them up in that place. The baby, on the other hand, would seem on the verge of transforming back into that dark stain. But then it would fully take the form of a baby. Charlie would ask if the baby was okay. The men in suits and the restaurant owner would be discussing going to an expensive place that night after receiving payment from Dr. Hyen, while the man in the black suit would decline, telling them to enjoy themselves without him. The scarred man would sigh and ask how he could have fun, calling the man in the black suit gay, while behind him a dark silhouette would be opening the door. The restaurant owner would apologize, saying that the place had already closed, and the silhouette that had opened it was a man wearing a black jacket and a hood that covered his face except for his eyes. This would surprise everyone present, and the only one who would manage to react would be the man in the black suit, who could only say for them to run. But before anyone could do anything else, the scarred man's head would fly off his body, leaving Gail and the restaurant owner in complete shock at what they had just seen. The restaurant owner, screaming in fear, would ask what the hell the person who had just entered was, while Gail would silently and shockingly observe the hooded figure's blood-covered hands. The figure, without responding to any questions, would only demand that they hand over what he knew was there. Gail, on the other hand, would start laughing, and with a smile tell the hooded figure to die, only to end up being impaled through the chest by the same figure. The trembling restaurant owner would beg not to be killed, and the hooded figure would tell him to show the way. Meanwhile, in the basement, Charlie had covered the body of the man with the dolls that were in that place, and with the baby in his arms. Leaning against the door, he would wonder what the hell had happened, saying it was as if an animal had devoured him. As he stood up and looked through the cracks in the door, he would think that it didn't look like a prison, and would eventually deduce that they were using people as food. But he would wonder for what purpose, saying that he needed to get out of there and that he couldn't die, and thinking that he couldn't believe they had locked a baby in that place. Meanwhile, the baby would just stare at him, to which Charlie would ask what it was looking at and if it understood what was happening. Either way, they would think about why there were so many dolls there, but the baby wasn't dressed like them, and they would ask the baby if those were its dolls. Suddenly, footsteps would be heard behind him, down the hallway, and they would wonder what was happening, gradually seeing the silhouettes of people, thinking that they were the same men in suits who had left him there. Upon reaching the cell door, they would see the owner and the hooded figure. Upon opening the door, they would come face to face with Charlie, terrified but ready to defend himself, holding the bat in his hands. Upon seeing the people behind the door, he would become confused, mistaking his former boss as one of them, only to quickly have a puddle of blood spread across the floor, surprising Charlie but not the baby. This puddle of blood had been caused by the hooded figure, who, in a split second, had slit the throat of the restaurant owner, frightening Charlie. Charlie would start trembling with fear and step back. On the other hand, the hooded figure would look at him and say it wasn't him, then start looking at the baby, stating that it was, while the baby, with its distorted vision, would see the hooded figure as a complete threat. Meanwhile, Charlie, still fearful, would shout at the figure to stay away as he approached to strike him with the bat, only for the hooded figure to catch his hand barehanded and, with brute force, break the bat. With great speed, the figure would prepare to kill Charlie, who in his final moments would only remember his mother. But then, a black tentacle-like blotch would grab the hooded figure's hand, pinning him against the wall. Charlie would then turn around and see that the baby had disappeared, replaced by that dark blotch, thinking it couldn't be possible. On the other hand, the figure would finally remove the hood and stare directly at the dark monster, which would lunge at him. But the figure would also do the same, where the dark blotch would have a clear advantage, managing to strike the figure and throw him to the ground. In an attempt to finish him off by devouring him, the figure would grab its mouth and struggle to avoid being consumed. And then, in a moment, the figure would take the opportunity to deliver a knee strike and an elbow strike towards the monster, destabilizing it to land a clean blow to the chest. But then, the monster would transform, change shape to try and attack the figure again. But the figure would jump and evade it once more. The monster and the figure would lock eyes, and the figure would say the word eliminating, and they would engage in another fight. Charlie would only escape from the place, thinking about what that had been and that he had to get away from that place. Upon reaching the restaurant door, he would come across the corpse of the scar-faced man and Gail, trembling and on the verge of vomiting, thinking that the hooded figure had gotten to them as well. But it turned out that Gail was still alive and was surprised to see that Charlie was too. Then, Charlie would quickly run away from the place, thinking that he needed to call the police. However, the memory of a girl's corpse would cross his mind, causing him to abruptly stop while trying to escape. Meanwhile, Gail would be panting on the floor of the restaurant and would be surprised to see Charlie running back into the basement of the same place. And Charlie, remembering where the scar-faced man had gotten the baseball bat from, would check the same cupboard where he would come across several weapons that he would stare at intently. On the other hand, the monster and the hooded figure would continue fighting, and the figure would gradually gain the upper hand, repeatedly striking the monster's face, realizing that was its weak point. And as the monster tried to defend itself, the figure would finally manage to dodge its attacks, understanding that its attack pattern was quite simple, delivering kicks and multiple punches again, gradually weakening it. The monster would then start vomiting, which the figure would take advantage of to continue striking it, and the monster would gradually become smaller and smaller until finally taking the form of an emotionless baby. The figure would observe this baby and prepare its hand to deliver a final blow, but at that moment, it would be stabbed by a sword, and upon turning to see who had done it, it would find that it was Charlie who had stabbed him. Charlie would observe the corpse of the figure and insult him once again. At the entrance door, Gail would be talking to the decapitated head of the scar-faced man, who would tell him that he had told him so, saying "I told you so," since he had always had a bad feeling about that job. Slowly, he began to lose consciousness and see everything blurry. One of the last things he would see would be Charlie holding the baby in his arms, wondering if that baby was the monster. Finally, he would die later that same night. Dr. Hyen would return to the place only to find the corpses of his employees. Meanwhile, Charlie ran with the baby in his arms until he reached the entrance of a police station. Before entering, he wondered if they would believe him. At the same time, two women passed by him, saying that he was covered in blood. One of them referred to Charlie while the other told her to be quiet as they could be overheard. Charlie would remember that he had stabbed the hooded figure while a police officer apparently came out to smoke, opening the door of his establishment. He would reach a park and there he would put the hoodie he was wearing on the baby to cover it with something, saying that he had no choice. He wondered what he should do while feeling that everyone's eyes were fixed on him and that he couldn't escape from that place. Finally, he would arrive at an unfamiliar street where it started to rain. There, he would wonder where he was and he would ask a woman passing by what she would say if he told her that he wasn't from there. The woman would tell him to go away, as that wasn't the place for kids like him. While Charlie only thought that he would fit in badly as a boy like him, he would continue walking through those same streets until he reached an abandoned house. Thinking that he would spend the night there, Charlie remembered the first time he had run away from home. That day, he slept on the emergency stairs. As he looked at the baby, he thought that she looked like a boiled mess and that he couldn't believe that she was that monster. He wondered what she was, if she was an alien or a mutant. He thought that the prison had been created to contain this baby and that if the men in suits were trying to feed the monster with it, it meant that the body that was there had also been food. Then, Charlie realized that she, instead of trying to devour him, had protected him for some reason. Thinking about the hooded figure, he wondered what the hell he was. He wondered if he was there to kill the baby. Realizing that this was also inhuman, he wondered what the hell was happening. He thought that maybe he should have just run away and that he didn't ask why and didn't understand why he had come back. At that moment, Charlie would start having memories of his childhood. He would see how one child brutally beat another, and he would just watch in terror, until finally turning around and leaving to the mercy of a seemingly helpless girl whom he didn't want to help. Remembering this with frustration, he would start crying in the place. The baby would start making some noises, and Charlie would ask her if he had woken her up, saying he was sorry. The baby would only grab his jacket, making Charlie wonder if she really was a monster. The next morning, after the rain had stopped, two stray cats would start approaching Charlie and the baby, who were asleep. The baby would slowly start waking up, seeing the cats as a threat. She would start taking her monster form, but then she would remember the recent fight she had with the hooded figure as a trauma, causing the frightened baby to be unable to assume her monster form and start crying. Then Charlie, confused, would ask what was happening while the baby cried more and more. Charlie would realize that the two wild cats, assuming that they were the ones who had scared the baby, would scare them both away from that place. Taking the baby in his arms, he would tell her that everything was okay, that the cats were gone, that she was safe, and he would tell her not to worry, that everything would be fine. Elsewhere, a man was apparently on a call. He said that none of the bodies belonged to one of his agents or to Dr. Hyen, and that he couldn't contact or locate the missing agent on the other end of the call. The individual would only ask if she didn't want to report anything else. The individual would apparently be standing on the roof of a building, watching the restaurant burn. He would report to the person on the call that he had found a room and traces of something locked inside, and that the details were in the data he sent him. While people would be murmuring about the building that caught fire, the call from the person on the roof of the building would end, as he simply watched the restaurant burn. Meanwhile, the person on the other end of the call would be talking to someone else, who would question him. The person would be talking to himself, thinking about that something locked inside and that his agent had been killed by it, wondering if that meant he had been successful. But he would realize that no, otherwise he wouldn't be hiding. While this person was lost in his thoughts, another person would enter the room to grant him entry and tell Dr. Hyen that it was time. In an apparently important conference, the doctor would be giving a talk to people who seemed to be suited agents and military personnel, thanking them all for making space in their busy schedules to attend the talk. He would tell them that on that day, he was going to present something that had been made possible thanks to their investments, and he would reveal something called the Human Enhancement Project. He would announce that the project had been completed despite all the trials, errors, and accidents they had faced along the way. A syringe was being shown on a screen, and he would explain the capabilities of this syringe, which were infinite regeneration and extraordinary physical abilities. He said that now humans could surpass their limits with the help of this simple syringe. In another place, we would see a chained individual on their knees and arms, apparently the same hooded individual as before. He would raise his gaze to meet another person in front of him, who would look at him with a smile on his face. The chains would finally release the first individual, who would stare intently at the person in front of him, and the sounds of a fight would begin to be heard. This fight would be happening next to the same room where Dr. Hyen was, who was reading some papers. Meanwhile, in the same conference that Dr. Hyen was giving, the people who had come to see him would start applauding him after it ended. Then, an important person in a suit would tell him that it had been incredible and that everyone was starting to sign contracts with them. He would say that all they had to do was swim in money and that all of this was thanks to him, and that he should take it as a reward for his hard work, to which Hyen would simply say thank you. Meanwhile, Charlie and the baby would continue sleeping in that abandoned house, being observed by a woman who would say they looked cute together. After a few hours, Charlie would slowly open his eyes and finally jump up upon hearing the baby crying, only to find that she was being held by someone else who was asking why she was crying and trying to calm her down. Charlie would just look at the girl wondering who she was and saying that the baby was dangerous. The girl would tell Charlie that she was told to come and get her, which would confuse Charlie. The girl would give the baby back to him and ask if she was his baby or his sister, to which Charlie would respond neither. After returning to Charlie's arms, the baby would finally stop crying. Confused, Charlie would ask who told her to come and get him. The girl would say that he was probably hungry and that they should first go and eat something. The girl would talk about the place, saying that it was a bit run down but that he could get used to it over time. Charlie would realize that she was avoiding his questions as she led him to have breakfast, wondering who the hell she was. The girl would then stop to greet someone, asking if they would also go for breakfast. This someone would respond that he should eat when he could, after all, and she would laugh, saying that she didn't like that he didn't like buying food. Then we would see that the girl was talking to a muscular man who had appeared on the way. And as he looked at Charlie, this man would say who he was and that he even had a baby. The girl would say she didn't know and wouldn't ask if he was cute. The man would only say he wasn't cute, to which the girl would simply say not to be mean, while Charlie would only wonder who that muscular guy was. As they walked, several people would greet Charlie, who would be confused and wonder if all these people lived in that town and what was happening, thinking this was strange and wondering if he was about to be deceived again. The girl, realizing this, would tell him not to be nervous and that everything was fine. Upon arriving at what seemed to be a community dining room, Charlie wondered why everyone was going to the same building. Everyone would be eating as if it were a restaurant, even though it clearly wasn't. Confused, Charlie wondered if they were all going to eat together, wondering what kind of place this was and thinking that if the baby were to transform, it would be a massacre. Charlie then began to observe the people around him, until a voice would be heard asking if everyone was there, to which the girl would respond yes, and Charlie would see that it was the same old woman from the previous night. She would tell everyone they could start eating. While everyone was eating, the girl would try to take the baby from Charlie's arms, saying that he could eat in peace and that she would feed her. But then the baby would start crying again. This would start attracting the attention of everyone present. While the girl tried to calm her down, she would ultimately fail and give the baby back to Charlie, and she would say that they had done all of this especially for her, while Charlie would only think that she wouldn't eat any of it. while trying to give her what seemed to be a spoonful of soup and doubting that she would eat it. He would give it to her only to his surprise. The baby would eat it. Charlie, with a smile and feeling calmer, realized that she might be friendly and more relaxed. But when he looked up, he noticed that everyone in the place was watching him. Then, a woman sitting across from Charlie would say that the baby was cute, mentioning her small and round cheeks, while Charlie could only think that she wouldn't say the same if she saw her transforming into the monster. After the meal and everyone expressing their gratitude, the protagonist would say that it was good, after showing that he was full. But before he could get up, the grandmother would ask him how the food was, to which he would thank her and say that it was good. The grandmother would then ask him if he had any plans of where he would go now, but the boy would stay silent for a few minutes. Then the grandmother would tell him that if he had nowhere to go, she would tell him that he had nowhere to listen, since he had run away. Charlie would wonder in surprise how she knew, and she would reply that maybe she was blind, but there were things she could still see. Leaving Tanito, our protagonist, who for a moment looked at the baby and then asked the old woman if she could see what was different about that baby. The grandmother would remain silent for a few seconds and then ask him if it mattered, telling him that he could stay as long as he wanted in that town, that he would have a roof over his head and food, so it wouldn't be so bad. This surprised the protagonist, and he wondered if she was really serious, to which the grandmother would respond that this town and all the surrounding mountains belonged to her, and that he should feel at home, because even though it didn't seem like it, she was actually quite rich. Then, with great effort, he managed to stand up and start walking, and he told the girl Sophie, who had brought him here, that the house next to hers was empty, so our protagonist could live there. The girl agreed. Charlie, on the other hand, was still contemplating, confused by everything that had happened recently. Then, before crossing the door to leave, the grandmother would tell him that Sophie would tell him all the details and that they would meet again. In our protagonist's new house, Sophie was giving him a small tour of the place and told him that she lived next door, so if he needed anything, he could always go and ask her. Furthermore, someone lived there until recently, so there should be everything he needed. Charlie would still wonder if this was real and ask if he could stay there, to which the girl would say that there was no problem and he could stay as long as he wanted. That's how she started living there. The protagonist would wonder if everyone in this town had started in the same way, to which Sophie would say that almost everyone did and that she also found it strange. The protagonist would ask what kind of place that was, to which Sophie would begin to tell us that most of the residents had nowhere to go, but they were never asked where they came from or what they had done. They were just accepted, given a place to stay, and provided with 3 meals a day at no cost. That's how the grandmother managed things. The only thing they had to keep in mind is that they had to eat with the rest of the people in that place. There would be no other meals, so if you don't eat during those hours, you'll have to take care of yourself. And it didn't matter what you did outside the town, but you shouldn't cause trouble while living there. The protagonist would ask why the old woman went to such lengths for all of them, to which the girl would respond that she would like to know too, and that the longer she stayed there, the less it made sense, being unconditionally kind to complete strangers. Many people simply left the town without showing any gratitude, while others just disappeared with a few words. But even when Sophie asked, the grandmother never said much. The protagonist asked if she was her granddaughter, to which Sophie said no. Then she would tell the protagonist that she heard what he said about the baby, and she would ask him what was different about her. Charlie would look at her for a few seconds, something that the girl would notice and say that maybe she shouldn't have asked, and that he didn't have to worry about answering that question if he didn't want to. But the protagonist would interrupt, saying that the baby was a monster, that she had the ability to transform into one, and that she even managed to devour people. The girl would silently look for a few seconds, and then she would say that the baby didn't devour him, so she believed that the other residents wouldn't be devoured either. Charlie would ask her how she could be so sure, to which she would respond that otherwise she wouldn't let him stay there. Charlie would silently look at the girl for a few seconds, and then he would say if the old woman was some kind of wealthy shaman or something. A comment that Sophie would laugh at, saying that who knows, and maybe she was. The protagonist would then say that yesterday the grandmother told him to leave the place, a comment that would also make Sophie laugh, saying that in the end, she didn't do it. Then they would introduce themselves and ask each other's ages. The protagonist would say he is 19 years old, while Sophie was 6 years older. Then she would ask for the baby's name. Charlie would remain silent because he didn't even know it himself. This would surprise the girl, and she would say it was strange that he didn't know the name of the baby he was taking care of, even though she only listened to him. Therefore, surprised, she would ask if he kidnapped the baby. The protagonist would say no. Sophie, before leaving, would say she was just joking and it was nice to meet Charlie, and she would see him later. Being alone, Charlie would wonder if she really believed what he said. Later, Charlie would be trying to bathe the baby, who was crying because of the bath. Charlie threatened that if she continued like that, he wouldn't bathe her again because he was having trouble in this first attempt. After the bath, Charlie would say to look how well she looked now that she was clean, but her hair had turned iridescent, which would make him laugh, saying that it reminded him of himself when he was a child. At that moment he would think of Sophie's comment. The baby should have a name, so he would think that if he was called Charlie, the baby could be called Charlotte, and he would tell Charlotte to try to say her name. Just in the end, he would think that she still couldn't speak, but the baby would surprise him by saying the word cha, making Charlie very happy, and he would try again to get the baby to say her name, thinking that in that moment, the protagonist felt truly happy, thinking that he didn't know how long they would be together and starting to recount how they had started living in that town, where everyone lived their own lives. But when it was time, everyone would gather to eat at the grandmother's house. Some people were friendly and others were not, and no one knew where the others came from or what they had done. Many people did nothing all day, as Sophie said, while others were always busy elsewhere. And then we can see how a couple of police officers are taking someone away, who, before leaving, turns to look at the grandmother and thanks her for everything, to which she responds that when they get out, they can come back there if they want. After this, 6 months would pass, where the protagonist would continue to say that Charlotte had never transformed into that monster again, and it seemed as if everything he had seen in the past had been just a bad dream. But if there was something that reminded him of that time in the basement, it was that the dogs in the town always gathered around Charlotte. Every time this happened, she would take refuge behind Charlie. We would see how in those 6 months, Charlotte had grown to look like a girl of maybe 12 years old. That in those 6 months, she had grown excessively fast, extremely fast. Then, we would see how Charlie was trying to teach Charlotte how to ride a bike. She would tell him not to let go, while he would say that she was still a baby and that when he was her age, he was already riding motorcycles. To which Charlotte would respond that he always bragged every time he taught her something, while she wobbled on the bike. Charlie would tell Charlotte to keep her balance, to trust him because she was doing well, and there was nothing to fear. Charlotte would say she was scared and ask him not to let go, while Charlie would simply tell her to keep looking ahead. Finally, he would let go so Charlotte could continue walking on her own. This would upset Charlotte, who would call him a traitor since she had asked him not to let go. In the present, the dog would be growling and threatening Charlotte, and Charlie would seem annoyed because it wasn't the first time it happened. He would say that someone needed to put a leash on it, while Charlotte would see it as a threat and start slowly transforming into her monstrous form. However, she would remember the traumatic fight with the hooded figure and be afraid of fully transforming. Charlie would manage to get rid of the dog and stroke Charlotte's head, saying that at least she hadn't been as scared as before. He would ask her if she remembered when she used to cry and run away, and they would continue walking. Charlie would promise that next time he would teach the dog a lesson, but Charlotte would say she didn't care. In the dining room, everyone would treat Charlotte with extreme kindness, giving her extra portions and the best part of their food. Charlie would get annoyed and ask them to stop bothering her, but they would respond that they were just taking care of her. Both the grandmother and Sophie would be very happy about this. After the meal, Charlie would help wash the dishes, surprising Sophie, who would say that it wasn't his turn to do it today. Charlie would say he just wanted to help, and Sophie would respond that she almost fell in love with him, to which Charlie would ask if only a little. In another part of the room, 2 adults would be watching Charlotte, thinking that she had grown too fast. They would wonder if she could die too soon due to her rapid growth in the last 6 months. One of the women would say that Charlotte could even die before her, wondering what illness she could have. Charlotte would overhear all this and have a nightmare that same night in which the hooded figure would be chasing her, and she would scream desperately for Charlie, who would be chatting happily with Sophie. However, armed with courage, Charlotte would say that she was no longer afraid of him and would start emerging in her monstrous form from the shadows. Then, she would take Charlie's hand and lead him to the place where they had fought, feeling proud of what had happened there. In reality, Charlie was just happy that after all the nightmares Charlotte had, she could finally have a good sleep. He would think about the past 6 months and how she had grown too fast, which made him wonder if she would continue to grow faster than others and die soon, as everyone says. When he's not transformed into a monster, he remembers that those last 6 months had been peaceful. Both the people in the town and the grandmother and Sophie thinking they were wonderful people. but remembering those moments in the basement that still haunted him to this day, and as he slept, he wished they could continue living that way forever. At that moment, a strange dark stain would appear on Charlotte's face, and a few moments later, she would be walking alone on the street. A few moments later, we would see that Charlotte, while Charlie was sleeping alone in bed. Then we would see the dog who was sleeping, but it would quickly wake up on alert and see a silhouette approaching in the distance, who turned out to be Charlotte. The dog would start growling threateningly again, but then it would be surprised to see that a strange black thing was emerging from Charlotte's face. Elsewhere, we would see the hooded figure in front of another man, while a voice in the background would be explaining the almost infinite regenerative capabilities of this hooded figure, one of which was almost infinite regenerative capabilities. A second voice would ask if there was then no way to kill one of these enhanced humans, to which the first voice would respond, surprising the second voice, who would ask if they were referring to the head and saying if it wasn't something too simple. At that moment, the person in the white shirt would draw their weapon and quickly shoot at the figure, who would quickly position themselves behind the person and grab them by the neck, ready to kill them. And at the last second, the person in the white shirt would surrender. These two people were a subject in a suit, thinking that it was something marvelous and that wars would never be the same again, as we had gone from fists to knives, then to guns, missiles, and now they had returned to fists. A second man behind him would say that he wished a new war would start and that he couldn't wait to see these enhanced humans in action. To which the man in the suit would say that now all they had to do was sit back and let the money flow, saying that Dr. Hyen had created the most powerful weapon on Earth. Meanwhile, the enhanced human would sense Charlie's presence. He was standing in front of him, facing Charlie, using his ability to transform into the monster. Elsewhere, we would see a person lying on a bed, connected to cables, and a strange black stain forming on their chest. We would see some people watching as apparently someone in front of them was fighting, and one of the girls would say not to look and that she was scared. A third person would suggest that someone should perhaps call the police. This same person was the dark-suited man from a few moments ago, sitting on the floor next to 3 corpses. We would hear how one of his friends would be taking them to meet some women, as apparently he had visited that place several times before, as the security guard had mentioned that it had been a long time since he last saw him. Then the 2 friends would each take a girl while Gail would stay still, observing from the spot. The friend who had brought them there would tell Gail to try to have fun and loosen up a bit. Then, this friend would call the escort he was with by her name, which was Sophie, telling her to make sure his friend had a good time. After everything happened, Gail would ask Sophie how old she was, to which she would say she was 20. Then, Gail would ask her how she ended up there, to which she would only ask, while removing her bra, if they were going to do it or not. Instead of answering her question, Gail would ask her why she was working in that place, to which Sophie would respond with another question. They would both stare at each other for a few seconds. After a while, one of Gail's friends would say he was exhausted and wanted to play pool, and the other friend would agree. But Gail would say he would go somewhere else. His friends would know where he was going, and one of them would regret having brought him there the previous time. Then, we would see Gail and Sophie in the same room, just talking. Gail would ask her if she could find another job, to which Sophie would ask why it mattered to him so much. On another night, Gail had visited Sophie again, and she would ask him how that had happened, referring to the wounds she was healing. Gail would simply say not to worry about it. Then, Sophie would tell him to stop moving and guess that he had been in a fight, saying that he was already too old for that, finally putting the last bandage on his eyebrow. Then, they would both try to sleep, but Sophie would suddenly ask Gail if he had a family, to which he would ask her what made her think that. Then, she would tell him that they both smelled the same, to which she would say she could smell it because he emitted the same scent as her. Gail would then ask her if she could go back in time, if she would work in that same place again. To which she, looking into Gail's eyes for a few seconds, would respond no. Gail was then ready to leave, but Sophie would stop him, asking if he had any goals in his life. Some time later, one night, we would see someone's throat being cut and a person indiscriminately killing many people who were trying to defend themselves. All of this being witnessed by a trembling and terrified Sophie. It turned out that Gail had done all of this, and he would simply say that he felt like killing someone and those guys happened to be there. After this, in prison, Gail would be listening to the conversation of other inmates, and one of them would be saying that he was going to get out of that damn place soon and make a lot of money when he gets out, which other prisoners would laugh at. But this first scar-faced prisoner would look at Gail and ask if he believed him. Then we would jump to the moment where this same scar-faced individual would lose his head, and we would see Gail's last moments, from the monster in the basement to the moment he kidnapped Charlie and was killed by the hooded figure. his last memory being the protagonist holding the baby in his arms. And at that moment, we would see that Charlie didn't die thanks to the doctor injecting her with a syringe at the last minute. Then she would finally regain consciousness, seeing that standing in front of him was the same doctor, and she would hear the whole story he had told her. Gail would ask if it was true about the human baby, to which Gail would be surprised that he didn't know, saying that when he took her, she looked like a monster, but she was a baby. He would ask what he knew about the boy, to which Gail would say practically nothing since he had just picked him up from the street, making Gail furious. Saying that he couldn't be human, Gail would then throw his cigarette, saying they needed to talk, asking what happened to him and saying what the hell that lunatic was. Seeing that the hooded figure was completely tied up in the center of the room they were in, Gail would then be testing his new abilities, cutting his arm with a knife, saying that this thing with enhanced humans was strange as he laughed like a madman, cutting his own arm to see how it regenerated, and summarizing the whole story of Hyen and the syringes, saying that the people making enhanced humans used those syringes and they were going to make tons of money with it. But then, Hyen created a monster much stronger than any enhanced human, and these almost millionaires began to get scared. So they started looking for Hyen and that monster to have them killed before things got dangerous. That lunatic, referring to the hooded figure, was one of those sent after them. Hyen would only agree with everything he said. Then, Gail would take a syringe and say that when he was about to die, Hyen injected him with that, turning him into an enhanced human, looking him in the eyes, and saying what would happen if he didn't accept his bet, his proposal, and that he never liked him, so he could kill him right then and there. Hyen would only say that he's not the type to worry about trivial things like that, and that Gail would have his reward, but he would smile and ask if he can't tell if he is brave or just very clever. Then he would ask if he worked with him, could he fight more things like that? To which Hyen would say that, referring to the hooded figure, probably yes, since they were being hunted and they would try to kill them when they found them. Gail would then say he couldn't wait any longer and immediately accept the offer, saying that he will keep going until he finds that monster. Then, Gail would ask why he had brought that lunatic and if he was thinking of making him switch sides. But Hyen would respond that it would be impossible, as enhanced humans don't have emotions, which allows perfect control over them. So they wouldn't listen to anyone else, as they had superior regenerative and combat abilities. Then, at some point, they would try to rebel against their masters in search of freedom, as they had superior capabilities. And that's why they needed to be kept under constant control, saying they were emotionless agents who could carry out any mission with perfect rationality. Gail would then say that they were basically robots and ask why they went to such lengths to turn them into agents. Hyen would simply say that what wouldn't a person do for money? Then, Hyen would say that Gail had nothing to worry about, as his emotions were still there. Gail would ask why they continued, and he would say that if it would have been simpler to just remove them if he wanted control. But Hyen would say that he did want to do that, but he didn't have the necessary tools, and would ask what he would do with the psychopath. Hyen would say that he was his new training partner, stating that Gail was now an enhanced human, but he would have to train to fight against other agents since they didn't know how many they would face. So he had to train as much as possible. Since both of them could train infinitely, he was the perfect training partner, something that sounded good to Gail, who would make him pay in the end. Standing up and grabbing the head of the psychopath, he would say that when everything else is equal, only talent matters. Then we would return to the scene of the hooded figure, facing someone directly, now knowing it's the same psychopath and Gail, who was excited to train with that individual and ready to fight. They engaged in an intense battle, in which the psychopath would ultimately emerge victorious, knocking out Gail, who was once again in bed and connected to hospital equipment by cables. Gail would hear Hyen say that he seemed to have no talent and warn him not to let him destroy his brain. Meanwhile, Gail, with a smile and slowly regenerating his face, would say that he was now furious. Once again, we would witness another fight between Hyen and the psychopath, where Hyen would be using dirtier techniques this time, such as attacking the eyes or biting the neck. They would have continued like this for 6 months, with Gail missing an arm, wondering if no other enhanced humans had attacked them in that place, questioning whether they hadn't been able to find them or had simply given up. As he stood up, he thought he had had enough of it and began walking towards the psychopath, saying that he was quite tough, and that he should have cut off his legs and arms, even had to take his organs to stop him, saying that he was going to kill him now. But before that, he asked him, looking him in the eyes, if he was scared and if he didn't want to live. The psychopath would be silent for a few seconds, but then he would try to say something, only to be interrupted because Gail would kill him before he could say anything else, saying not to try to change now. At that moment, he would be surprised as he turned around to find the figure of Charlotte, starting to use her ability to transform into a monster, which all the other enhanced subjects would also witness simultaneously. Meanwhile, back in the town, we would see Charlotte standing in the same alley where she had killed that dog. Then we would see Gail coming out of the training room. Finally, Dr. Hyen was not there, wondering where he had gone and what would have happened if he had lost, saying that for a guy seeking protection, he goes out too much, and thinking he was the only one working there. Then he would start looking around the room where there was a map with different marks and papers with missing people's names as well as other scattered documents. Finally, Gail would say that Hyen was smart for saving his life. Elsewhere, in a bar, the owner would be telling Hyen that he couldn't sleep there, to which Hyen would just stand up and complain that he had been woken up. The owner would tell him he had to pay, to which Hyen would simply throw his money on the floor, telling the owner to pick it up. He said that 3 guys in the bar had seen Hyen walking through an alley. These same 3 guys would talk to him, saying that if he threw money like that, he was asking to be robbed. Hyen would just turn around laughing, wondering if they were beggars and taking out the money he had on him. He would say that if they wanted money, they could take it, and he would throw it into the sewer, mocking them, saying they should go and walk around there, telling them to bend over and pick it up since they were cockroaches. This would anger the guys, who would beat him up, telling him they didn't want to hear it all. Next time, they would rob him, and wondering who was crawling now, to which the other would respond that they would take him and continue from there. Then the 3 would try to retrieve the money that had fallen into the sewer. Then they would hear a voice coming from behind them, asking if they were really going after that, and if they were really cockroaches. The guy would then turn around wondering who that cripple was, only to find Gail, who was missing an arm, but that they were pathetic and thinking he should teach them a lesson. One of those guys, in an arrogant manner, would ask if he was really going to let them go, but before he could finish the sentence, Gail would kill him with a punch to the face and quickly manage to hit the other guy in the ribs. The 3rd guy would barely have time to react to all this, and Gail would kill him, realizing that fighting against humans now was too easy since he was much stronger compared to them. Meanwhile, Hyen on the ground would tell him not to get cocky, as he had only defeated 3 humans. Gail would stand at his height and ask him why he didn't use the syringe on him and that if he had done that, this wouldn't have happened. Annoyed, Hyen would just curse, saying that if his plan had worked, an enhanced human would be nothing. And frustrated, he would start cursing, saying they couldn't find him. Gail would spit, saying that the doctor really was something and it was no wonder the baby never came back. But it seemed like he had grown up well, a comment that would confuse Hyen. Then he would tell him that he believed he had found that monster. Back in the village, Charlie would be just waking up. Upon realizing that Charlotte had slept next to him, stretching as he exited the street, he would see that at the end of the street, everyone was gathered around something. Approaching, he would hear people lamenting about a puppy and wondering if it had been a wild animal. Charlie, upon arriving and seeing the situation, would remember what had happened the night he met Charlotte, both the bodies and her monster form. The fear on his face would be something that Sophie would notice. Sophie and the grandmother would notice. Later, while everyone was eating, Charlotte would stare at her food, remembering what had happened the previous night and observing her surroundings. As everyone else ate peacefully, they would once again offer Charlotte the best part of their food, which she would accept. After taking a bite of the food they had offered her, Charlotte and Charlie would go out for a walk. Charlie would tell Charlotte that the dog had died last night, to which Charlotte would ask in surprise. Charlie would hesitate for a second if it had been her and say that apparently everyone thought it was a wild animal. This comment would make Charlotte laugh, and remembering her dream, she would say that's not what happened. This comment would scare Charlie, and at that moment, Charlotte would start transforming back into her monster form, which would frighten Charlie even more until, at one point, he would shout at her to stop. This would also surprise Charlotte, but Charlie, between fear and anger, would shout at her to just stop. Meanwhile, in the grandmother's house, some people were discussing whether it was done by a wild animal, and that the next victim could be a person. At that moment, we would see the muscular man arrive at the building. Sophie would ask him why he hadn't eaten with them, but the man would simply ignore her and tell the grandmother that they needed to talk. In the room, he would ask the grandmother if she already knew, to which the grandmother wouldn't understand what he was referring to. Then, the muscular man would say that Charlotte was the one who killed the dog, stating that she was a monster and recalling what happened last night. He was smoking by the window of his house when suddenly he saw Charlotte standing in front of the dog. He would end up horrified by everything Charlotte did. Back in the present, the elderly woman would silently look at the muscular man. He would ask if she really knew, and instead of answering his question, the grandmother would say that she understood that he had seen that. Then, the muscular man would mockingly ask what she meant, and angrily ask if it wasn't obvious, saying that she was a monster, one he had never seen before. He asked if she didn't see what she did and how she could be so calm, and more importantly, why she let her into the village. He asked if she knew what it was, saying that she had to be a monster, because even though Charlotte transformed into a monster, he asked if she wasn't still the same Charlotte that everyone loved and cared for. He said that Charlotte hadn't changed, but what had changed was his perception of her. The muscular man would ask if she didn't understand, and then he would briefly wonder if he was the one who was wrong. Then, the muscular man would shout, hit the table, and say that next time, she could kill someone. He said that the next one could be her, and he would ask her how she could let her live among them all that time. He said that he should report it to the authorities to have her removed from there. The grandmother said that she didn't think that way and that he was letting his fears control him, which would confuse the big guy. He said that he could see things he didn't want to see, like his past, which would frighten the muscular man, who would remember committing a murder. The grandmother would then ask him if he would kill someone else in the same way he thinks Charlotte would. And if it wasn't that, why was he so worried that Charlotte would do it? She said that Charlotte was a monster, but he wasn't. How does he define a monster? The man would just stay there thinking that she knows, referring to his past. The grandmother, on her part, said it was a strong killer aura and asked if he was going to kill her, fearing that he would tell someone. Then, she would ask him why he remained silent all that time, and now that she knew, what difference did it make? The man would only ask why she accepted him, to which the old woman would respond that maybe she was just dreaming of something that was impossible. But after a few seconds of silence, the muscular man would say that it would be better if she didn't call the police. While all this was being heard by Sophie, the grandmother would reply that she regretted him thinking she had to say that. Back at Charlie's house, we would see Charlotte looking at herself in the mirror, remembering a conversation she had just had with Charlie. He said that she was different from others and that's why she shouldn't show that monster form to anyone ever again. To which Charlotte would ask, why not? And Charlie would reply that he had already told her and that people would be scared and could start hating her, something that Charlotte wouldn't understand. But Charlie would continue talking, saying that she would never kill or eat any animal or person again and that she could only eat regular food. He told her it was a promise and if she broke that promise, they could be separated forever. This idea of being separated from Charlie scared Charlotte, who said she wouldn't transform again. Then, worried, Charlotte would ask Charlie if he would also hate her if she transformed. After thinking for a few seconds, Charlie said he liked her human form better, and that he wouldn't eat anything, only to end up turning back into his human form, thinking he wouldn't kill anyone, while the grandmother wondered how much she saw and how much she should ignore. At that moment, he called Sophie, indicating that he knew she had been listening the whole time. He would ask her if she was afraid of Charlotte, to which Sophie would respond that she wasn't sure. Meanwhile, the grandmother would say that she was still the kind and adorable girl they had known. Meanwhile, Charlotte was sitting on some stairs in the village, lost in thought, until suddenly she would see the muscular man watching her from afar, but now seeing him as a threat. In another part of a city, we would hear a meeting of important individuals discussing that the preparations were complete, and that they had done well so far, thanking Dr. Hyen for his hard work. After the inauguration ceremony, he would have much more work to do, saying that he would provide him with everything he needed, so he should prepare himself. Hyen would only say that he shouldn't worry, mentioning that the whole world was watching, so mistakes were not allowed. The last person would say that after the inauguration ceremony, they would become the center of the arms market and to make sure to prepare a grand spectacle. At that moment, Dr. Hyen would receive a phone call that would surprise him. In another room, all the enhanced individuals would be present, the ones who had called Hyen, saying that they had all felt something at the same time. One of them would respond affirmatively, mentioning that they didn't know the identity, but they all felt that same ominous presence. Then, Hyen would think that it could be the creation of Dr. Hyen and would ask them if they couldn't feel it at that moment. The enhanced individual would say yes and that they would report it as soon as they received another signal. Meanwhile, upon hearing this, Hyen would be lost in thought about how bad it was for him that it was happening exactly at that moment, and that he couldn't just sit around and do nothing, so he would form a search team in another location. To which the subject of these individuals would say that if they kept wandering around aimlessly, the enhanced humans would find and kill them. He would respond that the doctor had done the same before, so they would be fine, while looking out the window and saying that it was quiet now, but he could still feel it. But he could feel it, although he wasn't sure. Hyen asked him if he didn't think the other enhanced humans could find him. At that moment, Gail was looking out of her window at the village where they lived. As we approach the village, we see Charlie and Charlotte sleeping together. However, Sophie is chasing Charlie out of the room. Charlie says he wishes they could sleep together, but Sophie responds that Charlotte loves him too much for that to happen. After a few seconds of silence, Charlie stands up and says that Charlotte still needs to brush her teeth, and that maybe he should scold her. Sophie asks if he isn't afraid, to which Charlie responds that it's complicated. Upon returning home, Charlie tells Charlotte not to sleep with the light on and tells her she needs to brush her teeth. Charlotte quickly gets up to show him that she had already brushed her teeth, and to be sure, Charlie approaches and smells her breath. Indignant, Charlotte tells him that she will brush her teeth by herself from now on. Charlie challenges her, saying let's see how long she lasts. That same night, they sleep together again and time begins to pass once more. Charlie wonders if it's because she grew up surrounded by people or because of the promise. But Charlotte never transformed again and had returned to her previous self. On their way to the grandmother's house, they encounter another person from the village who asks if they are going to eat. This person says that today's menu is fried noodles, Charlotte's favorite. Charlie is happy, thinking that she is capable of living like a normal person and grateful that everyone has forgotten about the incident with the dog and that Charlotte is still loved by everyone. He thinks that everything is fine and will turn out well. One of the villagers realizes that they forgot to bring Pie Grand, the muscular man, as he hasn't been eating with them lately. So, he asks Charlotte if she can go and fetch him, as that guy loves Charlotte. Charlie smiles and says he knows where Uncle Pie Grand lives and that he will go get him. Charlotte accepts with a smile. Meanwhile, at Pie Grand's home, he would be surrounded by instant food, cigarettes, and alcohol. He thinks it has been too uncomfortable to go out to eat since the last incident, and if he exposes Charlotte as the monster she is, his own past could be revealed, and he should leave that place, but he has no money. At that moment, he hears someone calling him from the door and realizes it's Charlotte, who enters to tell him they should go and eat. However, upon entering, she encounters Pie Grand, who is holding a knife in front of her. This scares Charlotte, and she starts to transform into her monster form, also frightening Pie Grand, who lunges to attack her. Charlotte tries to defend herself, but she remembers Charlie's terrified face and the promise they made. Stopping at the last minute, Charlie is stabbed by Pie Grand. He starts bleeding and moaning in pain. But Pie Grand, with a look of pure terror, watches as Charlotte increasingly transforms into her monster form. He starts attacking her again, screaming for her to die, while everyone in the dining room enjoys their meal peacefully. Then we hear Sophie talking to Charlie, asking whom Charlotte went to fetch. Returning to Pie Grand, he continues stabbing Charlie's body, lying on the floor, until suddenly one of her tentacles stabs Pie Grand in the chest. Due to the adrenaline, he keeps trying to attack her, but then he is stabbed again by Charlotte. Charlotte looks at him in tears as her Uncle Pie Grand, with a look of hatred and fear, tells her that she will die sooner or later. He says that everyone will discover her secret and tear her apart. At that moment, he tries to stab her one last time, but Charlotte finishes destroying his body. Then, covered in blood and in tears, she leaves Pie Grand's house and heads towards Charlie, who would be talking to Sophie, telling her that he needs to go find her. So Charlie would quickly stand up, but halfway there he would stop when he sees that Charlotte has already arrived at the place, surprising all the people in the town, scaring them, creating an atmosphere of pure terror. Then, someone would realize and ask if that wasn't Charlotte. In the hallway, the grandmother would be listening to everything and wondering what was happening. Meanwhile, Charlie would be in front of Charlotte, who is injured and crying, complaining about the pain and trying to say something. But Charlie, angry and scared, would ask her what the hell she had been doing all that time. Then she would start to remember. They would start remembering the moments they had spent together, a time when Charlie was just becoming a girl, and other adults were trying to play with her. But Charlotte never took her eyes off Charlie, while other adults tried to get them to look at them too. But Charlotte never stopped looking at him, which made the other adults jealous. But then that entire reality would start to fade away, leaving Charlotte gradually alone, who, as she died, would think that she had no one. All of this being observed by both Charlie and the other people in the place. And that's how the first part of this manhwa ends. If you've reached this part of the video, let me tell you that you've been one of the few people to get here, so comment the word monster in the comments. Remember to subscribe to not miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.